You know, usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of clinical precision.
Oh, absolutely. It is very much like engineering.
Right. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the dark film, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is.
Yeah. It is broken or not broken. It is a very clean, binary reality.
Exactly. It is comforting. But then you step into the world of human communication, into the think of how we actually speak to one another out in the real world, and suddenly that beautiful, precise x-ray machine just shatters.
Right, because we are looking at a linguistic landscape that is murky and chaotic and entirely unpredictable.
Yeah. Today, we are taking an x-ray of people like Taylor Swift, Donald Trump, and even sitcom characters to show you the glowing hidden code of the English language that you hear every single day, but you probably never actually notice.
Because the English you study in a textbook, the need, subject, verb, object structures, the perfectly enunciated syllables, it almost never perfectly matches the messy, blended, culturally loaded English you actually hear in the wild.
No, it never does. And the stakes here are actually incredibly high for you listening. Whether you are actively learning English as a second language or you are a native speaker who has spoken it for decades, active listening is essentially a superpower.
It really is. I mean, we spend an enormous amount of our daily energy focusing on what we want to say, but by deeply analyzing how others speak, like the specific register they choose or the harsh sounds they swallow, the cultural idioms they twist, we reveal the hidden mechanics of human influence, humor, and connection.
I love visualizing it like that movie, The Matrix. When Neo finally stops seeing the simulated world as just walls and doors and starts seeing the actual glowing green code raining down the screen.
Yes, that's exactly what active listening feels like when you really turn it on.
Right. Instead of just hearing a string of words from your boss or your spouse, you suddenly see the grammar rules, the spatial metaphors, the subtle pronunciation shortcuts, all just floating right there, dictating the reality of the conversation.
You stop being a passive recipient of sound. You become an active decoder of meaning. And the source notes we are analyzing today from the Podzone Masterclass on English listening, they provide the perfect training ground for this.
They really do, because they have isolated these specific real-world audio clips to break down the actual mechanics of what happens when human beings try to connect. And our mission for this deep dive is to bridge that gap between the textbook and the real world.
Absolutely.
So let's start decoding right now with how language evolves in real time right in front of our faces. We are looking at the collision of highly informal internet slang and rigid academic language.
Right.
The source material uses a clip from Taylor Swift's commencement speech at New York University.
Which is such a great example. Picture the setting for a moment. This is a highly formal, deeply traditional environment.
Oh yeah, very formal.
You have the sea of purple caps and gowns, the university faculties in their regalia, the brass band. I mean, the architectural weight of academia is pressing down on the stadium.
And right in the middle of this incredibly traditional address, she drops this sentence. She says, "No matter how hard you try to avoid being cringe, you will look back on your life and cringe retrospectively."
It is a fascinating sentence.
It is. And I have to ask you about the mechanics of the very first part of that. Avoid being cringe. The word being feels like it is acting strangely there. What is the actual grammatical rule she is plugging this modern slang into?
Well, she is navigating a very strict structural mandate regarding what we call a gerund.
Wait, remind me, what exactly is a gerund? Is that just like any word ending in the ing?
Close, but specifically it is a verb ending in ing that has been transformed to act as a noun.
Okay, got it.
Like running is fun. Running is the gerund. In English grammar, certain verbs are highly dictatorial. They absolutely demand a specific grammatical form to follow them. And the verb avoid is one of these dictators. You cannot say, "I avoid to be." The brain rejects it. You must use the gerund form. So you avoid being. It is an invisible track laid down by the language, and she is perfectly adhering to it.
The source notes mention another dictatorial word right next to this, the word worry and the preposition about.
Yes. Think about how you express anxiety in English. You worry about something. Because about is a preposition. The rules dictate that whatever follows it must be a noun or a gerund.
Right.
So if you were visualizing that x-ray of the sentence, you see the preposition about forming a rigid locked joint. You worry about the exam, which is a noun.
Yeah.
Or you worry about failing the exam, which is a gerund.
So the skeleton of Swift's sentence, the underlying architecture, is incredibly traditional.
Very traditional.
But the meat she throws onto those traditional bones is completely modern. Let's talk about the word cringe. Historically, what is that word actually supposed to be doing?
Historically, cringe is an action. It is a verb describing a highly involuntary physical reaction of embarrassment, disgust, or submission.
Like a full body shudder.
Exactly. Think about the physiological response. You physically recoil. Your shoulders hike up toward your ears. Your facial muscles tighten. Your breath hitches. You cringe. It is something your body does in response to an external stimulus.
But she says avoid being cringe. She isn't describing an action there at all. She's describing a state of existence.
Right. She has completely transformed the word into a modern colloquial adjective. And this is a massive linguistic shift driven entirely by internet culture.
Yeah, you hear it online constantly.
On the internet, cringe morphed from the physical action you take into the description of the entity causing the action. 10 years ago, you might have said something was cringeworthy.
Oh, right. Cringeworthy.
But language always seeks efficiency. The worthy part was dropped. Now, a video is cringe. An outfit is cringe. A behavior is cringe. She took a piece of highly informal, deeply subjective internet slang and snapped it perfectly into that rigid grammatical slot.
That is already a fascinating blend. But the second half of the sentence is where the real sleight of hand happens. She pivots and says, "You will look back on your life and cringe retrospectively."
Which is brilliant because she reverts the word right back to its original traditional verb form.
Oh, wow.
The first time she says cringe, it is the modern slang adjective. The second time she says it, mere seconds later, it is the traditional action verb. She is telling the audience that you will physically flinch when you reflect on your past.
And she doesn't just revert to the traditional verb. She anchors it with this incredibly heavy formal adverb. Retrospectively.
The contrast is startling. I mean, retrospectively means looking back on past events. It has deep Latin roots. It sounds elevated. It carries intellectual weight, and it demands to be taken seriously.
Right.
It means exactly the same thing as in hindsight, but it dresses the concept up in an academic robe fit for a university commencement.
I'm trying to visualize why this works so well. It feels like someone showing up to a black tie gala wearing a perfectly tailored $1,000 tuxedo, but pairing it with bright neon scuffed up skateboard sneakers.
That is a perfect analogy.
You have cringe, this hyper-modern internet slang, practically touching retrospectively this heavy ancient academic term. Why does this specific friction capture an audience's attention so effectively?
It works because it violently subverts their expectations. And a subverted expectation forces the human brain to wake up and pay attention. Put yourself in the seats of that NYU stadium. If you stand at a podium and only deliver words like retrospectively, hindsight, reflection, and endeavor, the audience's brains categorize the speech as a standard formal address.
Right. They know the pattern.
Exactly. They don't need to process the words individually anymore. They tune out. They stop seeing the matrix code entirely.
And the reverse is true too, right? If she leaned too hard the other way and only used internet slang, trying to sound like a teenager,
she would instantly lose the authority of the podium. She would sound like she was pandering, trying desperately to be relatable, which ironically would induce a massive physical cringe from the audience.
Oh, definitely.
But by placing the slang adjective cringe and the Latin adverb retrospectively in the same breath, she executes a brilliant sociological maneuver.
She validates the lived digital casual experience of her younger audience.
Yes. Proving she speaks their daily language, while simultaneously proving she possesses the high-level vocabulary expected of someone granted an honorary doctorate. She builds immediate, intimate rapport without sacrificing a single ounce of absolute authority.
That is just brilliant linguistic calculus. But if blending high and low language is a tool for building connection, what happens when a speaker doesn't want connection at all?
That is a very different scenario.
What happens when the goal is absolute dominance?
Well, then we step into a completely different arena with entirely different physics. We move into the realm of highly contentious political rhetoric, where the primary objective is to assert control over the narrative and the opponent.
Before we unpack this next clip, I want to take a brief moment to set the ground rules for you listening. We are about to look at some highly recognizable political figures, starting with Donald Trump and then moving to Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau.
Right.
Our deep dive is treating these clips strictly as linguistic artifacts. We are putting them under the microscope to understand the mechanics of the speech, the rhythm, the vocabulary choices, and the framing devices. We are entirely impartial.
Absolutely impartial.
We are not endorsing, validating, or critiquing any political viewpoints or policies contained in the source material. We are simply mechanics looking at how the engine of influence actually runs.
Language is a tool. We are just analyzing the swing of the hammer.
Exactly. So the source material brings up a clip from a presidential debate. The moderator asks Donald Trump to name one single thing he respects about his opponent, Hillary Clinton.
And his response is this. He says, I will say this about Hillary. She doesn't quit. She doesn't give up. I respect that. I tell it like it is.
The Podzone Masterclass zooms in incredibly close on the very first sound out of his mouth. On paper, it is written as I will, two distinct equal words.
But in the physical reality of native fluent speech, it shrinks dramatically. It becomes the rapid, highly unstressed contraction L.
I'll say this. It almost vanishes into a single sharp syllable. Why does the mouth do that?
It is a hallmark of native fluency driven by the brain's desire for efficiency. The mouth is constantly searching for the path of least resistance to get to the core informational payload of the sentence.
Right.
The primary focus of his thought is not the fact that he is willing something into existence. The focus is on the opinion that is about to follow. So the I will is compressed into a tiny linguistic springboard.
And the phrase he leaps to, I'll say this about. The source notes flag this as a specific framing device.
It is an aggressive, commanding way to carve out narrative space on a crowded stage. When a speaker begins with, I'll say this about, they are performing an auditory equivalent of slamming their hand on the table.
Wow.
They're planting a flag. They're commanding the room to stop whatever thought process they are currently on, look directly at the speaker, and wait for the incoming pronouncement.
It violently redirects the listener's focus.
Which sets the stage for the rhythm of the actual opinion. She doesn't quit. She doesn't give up. The masterclass spends time exploring the semantic difference between the word quit and the phrase give up. They seem like identical concepts at first glance.
The distinction is subtle but profound. Quit is external. It usually refers to an action, a specific event in time. You leave a job permanently. You walk off the tennis court in the middle of a match. You have physically had enough and you stop the activity.
Right. Okay.
Give up, on the other hand, is entirely internal. It is psychological. It is about the surrender of hope. It describes the internal collapse of willpower after trying for a long, exhausting period. So, just to test that logic, you could technically quit a job that is destroying your mental health without giving up on your overarching career ambition.
Precisely. You stopped the action, but you didn't surrender the hope. However, in the context of this debate answer, he is deploying them to mean essentially the exact same thing. Relentless, aggressive persistence.
But if they mean the same thing in this context, why use both? I mean, if I am editing an essay, I cross one out because it is redundant. Why not just say, she doesn't quit, and leave it at that?
Because spoken rhetoric is not about written efficiency. It is about auditory impact. The repetition creates a hammering, deeply emphatic rhythm.
Oh, I see.
She doesn't quit. She doesn't give up. It is staccato. It is rhetorical amplification. He is using short, punchy Anglo-Saxon words that hit the listener's ear like a physical drumbeat.
Which builds perfectly to his concluding frame. I respect that. I tell it like it is. I want to really unpack. I tell it like it is. The notes describe this as a colloquialism for being honest, even when it is harsh. But it feels like it is doing so much more psychological work than just claiming honesty.
It is perhaps one of the most powerful psychological framing devices a speaker can deploy.
Really?
Yes. When someone uses the phrase, I tell it like it is, they are executing a massive philosophical maneuver. They are taking their highly subjective personal opinion, and they are magically recategorizing it as objective, unvarnished, universal reality.
They are essentially claiming they have direct, unfiltered access to the ultimate truth of the universe, and they're just generously passing it along to us.
Exactly. The mechanism. And think about the implicit shield it provides. If they declare that their words are just how it is, then implicitly, anyone who disagrees with them is not just disagreeing with an opinion, the opponent is denying reality itself.
That is why.
Furthermore, it acts as a preemptive apology that isn't really an apology. If the opinion they share is perceived by the audience as incredibly harsh, rude, or unconventional, the phrase I tell it like it is excuses the harshness as a painful but necessary byproduct of their heroic honesty. It makes rudeness a virtue.
You know, there is a very common assumption I hear all the time. People listen to language like this. The incredibly short sentences, the basic repetitive vocabulary like quit and give up, the colloquial cliches like tell it like it is, and they assume that a small vocabulary equals a lack of intellectual sophistication. They call it simple communication.
That is a dangerous and fundamentally flawed analytical trap.
Looking at this breakdown, I would argue the exact opposite. Starting a sentence with a violently commanding frame to hijack the room's attention, deploying rhythmic, staccato repetition to build physiological momentum in the listener, and then ending by hermetically sealing your subjective opinion as undeniable reality. That is highly advanced, incredibly strategic communication.
Absolutely.
It is purely about dominance, not linguistic complexity.
That is a vital insight for anyone listening to take to heart. Linguistic complexity, the size of your vocabulary and communicative power are completely untethered from one another. You do not need to wield academic Latinate words like retrospectively to dominate a debate stage or a boardroom.
Right.
In fact, in a highly contentious, high-stakes environment, stark, unadorned directness is almost always a sharper, more effective weapon for controlling the narrative.
So we have seen blending registers to build rapport and stark directness to assert control. Our deep dive notes now shift to a third political figure, demonstrating a completely different tool for navigating difficult topics: agility, wordplay, and the deliberate subversion of cultural idioms.
We are moving from blunt force to linguistic sleight of hand. We are looking at an excerpt from former President Barack Obama. He is giving a speech addressing a topic that is, quite frankly, profoundly dry and bureaucratic: agricultural regulatory reform, specifically a 40-year-old rule regarding dairy farmers.
Let me set the stage for this one because the context is crucial. The setup of the speech is that there was this ancient rule that could have forced American dairy farmers to spend upwards of $10,000 a year to prove they could contain a massive spill on their property.
Right.
Why? Because the regulatory bureaucracy had somehow classified milk as an oil.
Before we get to the brilliant punchline he delivers, the source material asks us to pause and look at the physical mechanics of the connected speech in his setup. We are back to analyzing the physical reality of spoken English versus written English.
Yeah.
He says the phrase, "we got rid of one rule."
And the masterclass notes point out that he does not pronounce got rid of as three distinct words. It physically blends into got rid of or even got rid of.
This is the phenomenon of assimilation and linking. The consonants bleed into the vowels. The sharp boundaries between the words dissolve completely. And the phrase itself, got rid of, is a crucial colloquial phrasal verb, meaning to eliminate, discard, or abolish.
Okay, yeah.
Then he uses a complex modal verb phrase, could have forced,
which, in the natural speed of the speech, degrades heavily into could have or just coulda forced.
The mouth completely drops the H in have. It takes too much breath to produce. And the remaining vowel is reduced to the laziest sound in the English language, the schwa sound and so could have degrades all the way down to coulda.
That happens so fast.
Now, the notes make a vital distinction here regarding the audience's expectation of correctness. If you write could have or coulda in a formal academic essay, you fail the test. It is grammatically incorrect. But if you stand at a podium and try to crisply enunciate could have distinctly in the middle of a fast-flowing anecdote, you sound completely robotic and unnatural.
You break the spell. You aren't flowing with the stream. So that is the phonetic reality of the setup. Now let's look at the vocabulary he chooses to frame the absurdity. He says this rule existed because milk was somehow classified as an oil. The masterclass really zeroes in on the insertion of the word somehow.
Let's remove it for a moment. Milk was classified as an oil. Classified as simply means categorized as. It's a statement of dry fact. But inserting the adverb somehow does a miraculous amount of heavy lifting for the speaker.
How so?
Somehow strongly implies that the reasoning behind an action is entirely mysterious, deeply illogical, or outright absurd.
It is the verbal equivalent of a shrug and an eye roll. It's like saying, by some bizarre, arcane twist of bureaucratic logic that no sane human being can possibly explain.
Yes. And notice what it achieves sociologically. Without ever explicitly insulting the intelligence of the people who wrote the rule 4 decades ago, the single word somehow instantly aligns the speaker and the audience in a state of mutual bewilderment. They're on the same team, looking at the absurdity of the government together.
Which perfectly primes the audience for the punchline. He finishes the story by saying, with a rule like that, I guess it was worth crying over spilled milk.
This is an absolute masterclass in subverting expectations through an idiomatic reversal.
It really is.
To truly understand why a room full of people erupts in laughter at a joke about agricultural regulations, you have to dissect the underlying cultural idiom. Don't cry over spilled milk.
Imagine you are learning English and you look up that phrase. It means don't fret over trivial things. Do not waste your emotional energy being upset about a minor mistake that has already happened and cannot be reversed. You knocked over a glass of milk, it's gone. Wipe up the puddle and move on with your life.
It is a proverb about emotional proportion. The spilled milk is the ultimate cultural symbol of a trivial, meaningless problem.
Right.
But Obama takes that deeply ingrained cultural symbol and flips it violently on its head. He said it was worth crying over spilled milk. Why? Because under this bizarre, specific regulation he just explained, spilling milk wasn't just a messy kitchen counter. It was legally classified as an oil spill, triggering a massive $10,000 regulatory burden for a farmer.
And a $10,000 penalty is decidedly not a trivial thing.
Exactly. He takes the symbol of triviality and instantly recontextualizes it as a devastating financial crisis. It is a brilliant, airtight, logical reversal.
Think about the cognitive process of the listener in that moment. It is like a magician's misdirection. The audience hears the setup. Their brain instantly recognizes the pattern. We are talking about spilling milk. I know the proverb that goes here. He is going to say we shouldn't cry over it.
Yes, the brain preloads the standard comforting cliche.
But the trick is the logical flip. By the time the audience's brain registers that the expected proverb was just shattered, the surprise of the new logic triggers a physical release of tension. A laugh. He takes a dry, heavy, profoundly boring topic and makes it instantly funny and incredibly memorable.
And it proves a deep, innate mastery of the language. You cannot construct a joke that agile unless you have a complete internal understanding of the exact cultural weight of the idiom you're breaking.
We have seen some incredible high-level strategies so far. Swift's register blending, Trump's hammering directness, Obama's idiomatic reversal. The final piece of political rhetoric in our source material shifts to how leaders handle highly complex abstract concepts and how they bridge the gap between academic theory and mass public comprehension.
We are analyzing an excerpt from the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
Okay.
He is delivering a highly formal address regarding international relations and foreign policy.
Okay.
The sentence we are decoding is this, and our new approach rests on what Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, has termed value-based realism. Or, to put another way, we aim to be both principled and pragmatic.
I want to start with the physical mechanics of the mouth again, the phonetics of this highly elevated speech. The masterclass notes flag the phrase rests on. Let's zoom in on what happens when a human mouth tries to say those two words together.
If you look at the phrase rests on written on a page, you see a severe clash of consonant sounds. You have the S, the T, and another S sound clustered together at the end of rests, and that cluster is immediately followed by the open vowel sound, O in on.
That is a lot of sounds to get through.
In natural flowing speech, even when delivering a formal address at a podium, the human mouth physically struggles to articulate that middle T clearly without coming to a complete jagged halt.
Wait, really? Is that a physical limitation or just laziness? Because if I concentrate, I can say rests T on.
You can, but you have to completely stop the airflow to hit the T and then restart it for the on. It ruins the cadence of the sentence. The English language hates stopping.
Oh, I see.
So the T gets dropped. It undergoes a process called elision. The phrase actually sounds like rests on. The T vanishes entirely into the ether to allow the final S to slide directly and smoothly into the O. The listener's brain is so accustomed to this missing letter that it unconsciously fills in the missing flesh based on the context of the sentence. They hear rests, even though the speaker only said rests.
And what does rests on actually mean in this highly diplomatic context?
It is the elevated vocabulary of diplomacy. It is a highly formal, spatial metaphor used instead of saying depends on or is based on. Think of the visual architecture. If a grand building rests on a foundation, that foundation is what supports its entire weight. If a nation's foreign policy rests on a specific concept, that theoretical concept is the supporting structure keeping the policy from collapsing.
The clip also uses the verb termed. He says what the president of Finland has termed value-based realism.
Again, we are looking at the vocabulary of authority. To term something simply means to give it a name or a title. But choosing to use the verb termed instead of the much more common named or called elevates the entire sentence.
It sounds so much more official.
It sounds official, academic, and codified. You name a pet, you term a geopolitical strategy.
So we have established this lofty diplomatic tone. Our approach rests on what he has termed value-based realism. Now, value-based realism is incredibly heavy jargon. It sounds incredibly smart, but if you stop 100 people on the street, 99 of them will have no idea what it actually means. It is abstract.
Right.
What happens next is what the masterclass finds so crucial for active listening. He says, or to put it another way, we aim to be both principled and pragmatic.
That specific phrase, to put another way, is a vital transitional tool for anyone dealing with complex information. It acts as an instant, real-time translation device embedded within the speech itself. The speaker recognizes that they have just deployed dense, abstract, exclusionary jargon. Instead of moving on and leaving the audience behind in confusion, they use this phrase as a flashing signal. Hold on, I know that was dense. I'm going to decode that concept for you right now.
And the decoding he provides is brilliant, principled and pragmatic.
It is a perfect, accessible distillation. The word principled beautifully translates the abstract value-based part, meaning we have strong moral goals, ethics, and beliefs driving us. And the word pragmatic translates the heavy realism part, meaning we are highly practical, we deal with the messy world as it actually exists, not just how we ideally wish it were.
I have a major structural question about this entire strategy, though. If the ultimate goal of communication, especially for a politician speaking on television, is to be clearly understood by the voting public, why use the complex exclusionary jargon in the first place?
That is a fair point.
Why say value-based realism at all? Why not just step to the microphone and say, we aim to be principled and pragmatic right from the very beginning?
That is a fantastic question, and exploring it gets to the very heart of why human beings use different registers of language. It comes down to the necessity of serving multiple, distinct audiences simultaneously.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
When a prime minister or a CEO speaks publicly, they are never just talking to the everyday citizen watching the evening news in their living room. They are simultaneously talking to other world leaders, academic theorists, hostile policy analysts, and historical record keepers.
Right. They have to prove they deserve to be standing at that podium in the first place.
Precisely. Using the complex academic term value-based realism establishes immediate diplomatic authority. It is a signal sent directly to the experts in the room that says, I have read the literature, I understand the high-level theoretical frameworks, I speak your specialized language. It builds unassailable credibility.
But if they only do that?
If a leader only uses jargon, they completely alienate the general public, who will view them as an out-of-touch elitist. So the speaker executes a linguistic two-step. They deploy the jargon to establish authority with the experts, and then they instantly deploy the translation phrase, to put it another way, to assure mass comprehension and likability with the general public.
It is the ultimate trick of having your cake and eating it too. You get the intellectual credit from the elite and the popular understanding from the masses, all in the same breath. We have spent the entire first half of this deep dive living in the rarefied air of highly staged, rehearsed public speaking, commencements, presidential debates, formal international addresses.
Very formal.
But the Pod Zone Masterclass recognizes that podium speeches are only a tiny fraction of how English is actually used. Now we are leaving the podium behind. We are pivoting into the messy, vibrant, spontaneous world of casual, everyday conversation.
And to explore this, the source material utilizes excerpts from popular television sitcoms, specifically The Big Bang Theory and Parks and Recreation.
I love those shows.
Sitcoms are actually incredible resources for deep linguistic analysis because the writers are painstakingly designing dialogue to mimic the natural rhythms, slang, and specific phrasing of everyday, informal human interaction.
And the masterclass does this through what they call a phrasal verb lightning round. I love this section because phrasal verbs, those little combinations of a verb and a preposition like give up or look back, are notoriously the most frustrating part of learning the English language. Their literal meanings almost never match their actual meanings.
They are the absolute glue of casual English conversation. You cannot achieve true fluency or fully understand native speakers without mastering them. The notes categorize these beautifully, so let's unpack them in thematic groups, and let's really focus on the visual and spatial metaphors of the prepositions involved.
Sounds great.
We will start with the realm of criticism and conflict. The clip from The Big Bang Theory is, whatever she dishes out, you can give it right back.
Dishes out.
To dish out means to criticize someone, often harshly, freely, or aggressively. But let's visualize the physical metaphor of the words. Imagine a harried cafeteria worker aggressively serving food from a massive bowl, indiscriminately slapping it onto plates.
That's quite an image.
The food is moving outward from a central source. They're dishing it out. In conversation, it means a person is serving up an outward projection of criticism, complaints, or insults onto the people around them.
The notes mention a great associated idiom here. You can dish it out, but you can't take it.
It is a classic, devastating critique of human hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It perfectly describes a personality type we have all encountered. Someone who is extremely happy to aggressively criticize others, to dish the food out onto everyone else's plates, but becomes incredibly defensive, wounded, or angry when someone attempts to serve that exact same criticism back onto their plate. They can't take it.
Right.
It is a fundamental assessment of someone's character using a simple culinary phrasal verb.
Moving from conflict to the messy process of pursuing a passion. The next clip is, we're all just muddling through, aren't we?
Muddling through. This is a beautifully evocative phrase. To muddle through means to achieve something or to merely survive a difficult situation without having a clear plan or expertise. You succeed by accident, by trial and error, by just blindly figuring it out as you go.
I love the visceral imagery of this one. Imagine you are literally walking through a field of thick, heavy, waist-deep mud. You cannot walk gracefully, you cannot sprint, you don't have a map, and you don't really know where your foot is going to land next.
Yes.
You are just pulling one heavy boot out with squelch, taking a sloppy step forward, and desperately hoping you eventually make it to solid ground on the other side.
That is exactly the emotional feeling the phrase conveys. It implies a total lack of elegance or mastery, but crucially, it also implies ultimate success. You do make it through the mud.
It's hopeful, in a way.
The notes use a highly relatable example. I had no recipe, but I muddled through making the cake, and it was delicious. The kitchen was a disaster. You didn't know what you were doing, but you survived the process and got the result.
And contrasting wildly with that lack of direction is the next phrasal verb. I'm excited to nerd out on it.
Nerd out on. This describes a psychological state of intense, hyper-focused passion. To nerd out on something means to discuss a highly niche topic with exhaustive, joyful, almost overwhelming enthusiasm. It usually implies that you are going into far more granular detail than the average person would ever care to hear.
It is the total opposite of muddling through in the mud. When you nerd out, you know exactly what you are talking about. You have a detailed map of the territory, and you care deeply about every single pebble on the path.
And linguistically, the term is fascinating because it is reclaiming a historically negative word. For decades, nerd was purely pejorative, a cruel insult for someone who is overly intellectual and socially awkward. But adding out on transforms it. Nerding out aggressively celebrates that deep, specific knowledge. You're pushing your enthusiasm out onto a specific topic.
I have to playfully point out that this entire deep dive we're doing right now is basically us just nerding out on language. We spent 10 minutes dissecting the drop tat in a Canadian diplomatic speech. We are fully, unapologetically nerding out.
It is true, and it is a wonderful state to be in.
But, as I think about these two specific verbs sitting next to each other, muddling through and nerding out, I would actually argue that muddling through is the single most perfect description of what it feels like to navigate a complex, real-world conversation when you are actively trying to learn a new language.
Oh, that is a great point.
You don't have the recipe. You are just desperately trying to get your basic point across, taking sloppy grammatical steps, hoping you are somewhat understood by the native speaker. You have to muddle through thousands of messy conversations until, eventually, years later, you achieve the fluency required to be able to sit back and nerd out.
That is a profound and highly encouraging way to look at the learning arc. You must muddle through before you can nerd out. The clumsy, messy mud is an absolutely necessary part of the journey to mastery.
Let's look at the next category in our lightning round, everyday actions. These are the logistical phrasal verbs that govern the mundane movements of daily life. The first one is from a character saying, of course he'll stick around.
Stick around. This simply means to stay in a specific physical place for a while longer than expected, usually waiting for an event to happen or a person to arrive. The visual metaphor is adherence. You don't leave. You physically stick to the location as if glued there.
I'll stick around until the bus finally comes.
Exactly. It conveys a very casual, low-stakes type of waiting.
Next is a phrase I hear constantly in households. Wash up for dinner, guys.
Wash up. This one is highly contextual and depends entirely on geographic location. In an American context, as the source notes astutely point out, it usually means specifically to clean your hands and face before sitting down for a meal, or right before going to bed. It is localized cleaning of the body.
Right, but it's different elsewhere.
Interestingly, in British English, washing up almost exclusively refers to doing the dirty dishes after the meal is over. But in the context of this American sitcom, it is the parents instructing the children to clean the dirt off their hands.
And the final logistical one, make sure if you leave, you lock up the house.
Lock up. We all understand the base verb to lock, as in putting a key in a single doorknob. But adding the preposition up completely changes the scope of the action. Lockup implies a comprehensive, systemic securing of an entire building or area.
It's a bigger job.
You don't just lock up a door, you lock up the entire house before a vacation, or a manager locks up the retail store at the end of the shift. It means securing all points of entry, turning off the lights, and completely shutting the perimeter down for the night. The up implies finality.
The final phrasal verb from our lightning round transitions to the show Parks and Recreation, and it deals with the beautiful realm of social annoyances. The quote is, "And while he was yammering on about whatever."
Yammering on. This is highly descriptive and instantly relatable. To yammer is to talk continuously, but specifically in a way that is profoundly irritating, complaining, or mindless to the listener.
Ugh, we all know someone who yammers.
It implies a total lack of intellectual substance and a severely high degree of annoyance.
Yeah.
But notice the crucial addition of the preposition on, yammering on. The on visualizes a continuous, never-ending horizontal line of speech stretching into infinity.
It is that terrible, droning, verbal white noise that slowly gives you a tension headache while you are desperately trying to politely escape the conversation.
Exactly. My neighbor yammered on about his lawnmower for an entire hour. The listener was physically trapped in the continuous stream of irritating sound.
So grasping these phrasal verbs, knowing precisely what it means when someone is yammering on or muddling through, that is a massive leap forward. But the masterclass notes make a really crucial pivot here. Knowing the vocabulary definition is only half the battle. To truly understand native speakers in the wild, you have to understand the physics of high-speed speech.
Yes, we're leaving the realm of vocabulary and entering the realm of physical acoustics. When native speakers talk casually, they absolutely do not pronounce words as isolated, perfectly formed islands of sound.
No, they definitely don't.
The words violently crash into each other. Syllables get swallowed, consonants morph into entirely different sounds, and the boundaries between words completely disappear.
The deep dive source provides two incredibly specific examples of this fast, blended speech. The first one is a short sentence. She's starting to rub off on you.
Let's address the meaning first before we analyze the sound. The phrasal verb here is rub off on you. This describes the phenomenon of behavioral osmosis.
Osmosis, I like that.
It means that by spending a significant amount of time with someone, their habits, personality traits, or attitudes slowly begin to affect and alter your own behavior. If your best friend is incredibly organized and you suddenly start using a color-coded daily planner, their organization has rubbed off on you.
It is exactly like leaning against a freshly painted wall. The wet paint transfers from one surface to another without you even realizing it until you look at your shirt.
A perfect visual metaphor. Now, let's look at the phonetics, the actual physiological physics of how this sentence is produced at high speed by the mouth. The notes break down the linking sounds meticulously. First, look at the phrase starting to.
Okay.
Informal, perfectly enunciated speech. A robot would say starting to. But in fast human speech, the ing loses all of its crispness and the hard T becomes severely softened. The entire phrase degrades into startin' to.
She's starting to.
Exactly. And then we hit the main phrasal verb, rub off on. This is where the true magic and chaos of connected speech happens. A native speaker absolutely does not stop the airflow from their lungs between these words. The final consonant of one word becomes the initial consonant of the next word if that next word starts with a vowel.
So the hard B in rub glides directly and seamlessly into the open O in off.
Yes, rub off. And then the F in off glides directly and seamlessly into the O in on, off on.
So instead of hearing three distinct separate words, rub off on, your ear receives a single trisyllabic block of uninterrupted sound. Rub off on.
She's starting to rub off on you. The mouth never stops moving forward. The vocal cords never stop vibrating.
I always like to compare this phenomenon to water flowing over a bed of stones in a river. When you read the words on a written page, the sharp consonants, the B's, the F's, the T's, they are like jagged individual stones sticking up out of the riverbed.
Right.
If you try to pronounce every single one perfectly, the water, which is your breath, has to violently stop and start hitting every single stone. But in fast, connected speech, The continuous, forceful flow of breath and vowels smooths right over those stones. The water rushes over them, creating a single, continuous ripple.
That is a beautiful way to think about it.
It makes the sentence incredibly efficient and fast for the speaker to produce, but it makes it overwhelmingly difficult for an untrained ear to catch where one word ends and the next begins.
That river analogy beautifully captures the listener's dilemma. The listener's brain is desperately trying to reach into the water and grab individual stones, but all they are feeling is the overwhelming rush of the water.
Let's look at the second fast speech example from the notes,
which illustrates another physical phenomenon. Cut her some slack, she's a newbie.
Starting with the definitions again to ground us, what does it actually mean to cut some slack?
This is a widely used idiom meaning to show leniency, to be significantly less critical, or to actively withhold harsh judgment when someone makes an error. The origin likely comes from handling ropes or mooring lines.
Oh, like on a boat.
If a rope is pulled entirely tight, there is absolutely no room for error or movement. It will snap under pressure. If you give the rope some slack, you loosen it, allowing for flexibility and movement.
You give the person room to make a mistake without snapping the rope. And what about newbie?
Newbie is highly common, informal slang for a beginner. Someone who is completely new to a job, a hobby, a complex video game, anything. So the entire sentence translates to be lenient with her. She is a beginner and is still learning how things work.
But again, the physics of the delivery is what creates the barrier to understanding. How does a native speaker actually say the two words, cut her?
They do not say cut her. They drop the H entirely.
I have to ask, why do we do that? Why does the English language seem to violently hate the letter H in fast speech? We just saw it disappear and could have become in coulda, and now it's gone again here.
It comes down to diaphragmatic effort. The H sound is an unvoiced fricative. It requires a significant, forceful expulsion of breath from the deep back of the throat. It takes physical effort from the diaphragm, and crucially, it briefly stops the forward phonetic momentum of the vocal cords.
Wow, it really is just physics.
In the subconscious rush to get the sentence out as efficiently as possible, the mouth simply skips the high-effort H entirely. The sharp T from cut links directly to the air vowel sound of the pronoun.
So cut her becomes cut her. Cut her some slack.
Exactly. When you listen to the audio, you are clearly hearing the word cutter, like a box cutter or a cookie cutter. But your brain has to know that in this specific fast-moving context, the sound cutter is actually two separate words, a verb plus a pronoun. This is exactly why active listening is described as a superpower. You are rapidly reverse engineering the lazy physics of the human mouth in real time.
Which brings us to the absolute peak of this mountain we've been climbing. If understanding fast, blended speech is considered an advanced skill, the masterclass notes argue that understanding humor, and specifically puns and wordplay, is the definitive final boss of language fluency.
It truly is the ultimate test. Humor is the ultimate stress test for language comprehension because it requires parallel processing. To understand a pun, your brain has to process phonetics, vocabulary definitions, and broader cultural context simultaneously, usually in a fraction of a second. If you miss even one of those layers, or if your processing speed is just half a second too slow, the joke fails completely.
The source notes unpack 3 specific jokes to demonstrate this multi-layered processing. Let's look at the first one. The joke is, what did the fried rice say to the shrimp? Don't walk away from me.
This is a classic, pure phonetic pun. It relies entirely on the linguistic concept of homophones.
Remind us what a homophone is.
Homophones are words that sound completely identical to the ear, but have wildly different spellings and wildly different definitions.
So when the joke is delivered, the brain hears the sound w-a-o-k. In the grammatical context of the sentence, don't blank away from me, the brain instantly slots in the verb w-a-l-k, meaning to move away on foot.
Precisely. But the setup of the joke, specifically mentioning fried rice and shrimp, simultaneously activates an entirely different semantic network in the brain, a network related to Asian cooking.
And specifically Asian cooking, which utilizes a W-O-K, a wok, the deep, curved frying pan.
So the listener's brain experiences a sudden cognitive collision. It expects the verb W-A-L-K based purely on the grammar of the sentence, but it is forced to suddenly recognize the noun W-O-K based on the contextual setup of the food. That sudden, harmless cognitive collision, the brain realizing it has been tricked by a sound, is exactly what produces the feeling of humor.
Okay, joke number 2 introduces a completely different layer. It's not just about sounds anymore, it requires deep external cultural knowledge. The joke is, did you hear Steve Harvey and his wife got into a massive fight? Yeah, it was a family feud.
If you are an English learner who has never watched American television, this joke is completely and utterly incomprehensible. You understand every single word, but you completely miss the meaning.
Right. If you just look at the strict dictionary definitions, a feud is a bitter, long-standing, often violent fight, usually between groups or families. So a husband and wife fighting is technically a family feud. If you don't know the culture, it's just a statement of sad domestic fact, not a joke.
But the punchline only activates, the humor only unlocks, if you possess a highly specific piece of pop culture trivia. Steve Harvey is the famous longtime host of a massively popular American television game show called Family Feud.
The humor is the cognitive overlay. The phrase family feud is simultaneously operating as a literal dictionary description of domestic conflict and as a capitalized proper noun referring directly to the man's career. The brain has to hold both of those realities at the exact same time to find it funny.
It is a brilliant intersection of vocabulary and cultural literacy.
Which perfectly sets up the third and final joke in the source notes, which I think is my favorite because it combines phonetics, modern tech jargon, and musical concepts into one tiny package. The joke is, why couldn't the computer dance? It had no algorithm.
Let's slow down and break down the incredible layers of processing required for the brain to understand this single punchline. First, the setup asks why a computer cannot dance. So the brain primes two completely unrelated categories, computer science and physical rhythmic movement.
Then the punchline hits. It had no algorithm.
Layer 1 is vocabulary. You must know that an algorithm is a specific set of rules or calculations a computer follows to perform a complex task. It is dense tech jargon. If you don't know what an algorithm is, the joke hits a brick wall and stops here.
Layer 2 is phonetics.
Right. You have to hear the phonetic breakdown of the word as it is spoken. Algorithm. The final suffix of the word sounds exactly identical to the standalone word rhythm.
And layer 3 is the musical concept. You have to know that rhythm is the ability to move in time with the beat, which is the fundamental physical requirement for dancing.
So the joke forces the listener's brain to take a dry mathematical term, algorithm, shatter it phonetically into distinct syllables, extract the final syllable, rhythm, and seamlessly apply that extracted syllable back to the initial premise of the joke, dancing. All of that happens in a quarter of a second.
You know, society at large often rolls its eyes at puns. There is this pervasive cultural cliche that the pun is the lowest form of humor. It gets a groan, not a laugh. But looking at the granular breakdown of these three jokes, I violently push back on that cliche.
I agree completely.
From a cognitive and linguistic standpoint, puns are not low humor at all. They are incredibly high-level, sophisticated cognitive puzzles. They require lightning-fast processing of multiple overlapping realities.
A pun is a neurological flex. When you finally understand a pun in a second language, or even when you appreciate a clever one in your native language, it proves that your brain has successfully mapped the complex three-dimensional boundaries of the language. You aren't just reciting definitions from a flashcard anymore. You are actively playing with the underlying architecture of the words. You are seeing the matrix code, and you are manipulating it for fun.
Which brings us beautifully full circle on this incredible journey today. We have gone from Taylor Swift casually dropping subjective internet slang into a highly formal university commencement to build rapport, to politicians violently hammering short words to dominate a debate stage, to leaders using dense jargon to look smart before translating it for the rest of us.
We really have covered a lot.
We have waded through the thick mud of sitcom phrasal verbs. We have watched sharp consonants completely disappear in the rushing river of fast connected speech. And we have solved the lightning-fast cognitive puzzles of the final boss, the pun.
And the overarching takeaway here, the reason the Podzone Masterclass source material is so profoundly valuable, is that paying attention to these microscopic details transforms everyday listening. It stops being a passive activity where you just let sound wash over you while you wait for your turn to speak. It becomes an active, highly engaging exploration of human nature.
It really does.
When you understand exactly why a politician drops a T or why a singer turns an adjective back into a verb, you aren't just improving your vocabulary. You are deepening your fundamental understanding of human connection. You are seeing exactly how we attempt to influence, entertain, assert dominance, and relate to one another.
It is the ultimate diagnostic tool, bringing us right back to our opening X-ray metaphor. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, unprompted thought experiment to chew on, something that builds on everything we've talked about today. Language is never static. It is a living, breathing, constantly moving organism. We saw how a modern internet slang word like cringe was elevated into formal grammar by Taylor Swift. We saw how a dry mathematical tech term like algorithm was bent into a mainstream pun.
Yes, language is always shifting.
So here's the question for you to consider as you go about your wit. What current, ridiculous-sounding internet slang or highly specific tech jargon that you are using right now in your text messages or your niche forums will become the formal, accepted, unironic idioms of 50 years from now? Will a future prime minister stand at a podium and casually talk about ghosting an international treaty? Will an American president describe a new economic initiative as going viral or glitching? The English of the future is being invented right now in the messiest, most informal parts of our daily conversations. I invite you to keep your ears open, listen closely to the water rushing over the stones, and see if you can spot the future of the language happening in real time.